Chapter 2. Honor is dead. 10 orders. We were loved ones. Why have you forsaken us, Almighty? Shard of my soul, where have you gone? Collected on the second day of Kakash, year 1171, 5 seconds before death. Subject was a light-eyed woman in her 3rd decade. 8 months later, Kaladin's stomach growled as he reached through the bars and accepted the bowl of slop. He pulled the small bowl, more a cup, between the bars, sniffed it, then grimaced as the caged wagon began to roll again. The sludgy gray slop was made from overcooked talu grain, and this batch was flecked with crusted bits of yesterday's meal. Revolting though it was all he would get. He began to eat, legs hanging out between the bars, watching the scenery pass. The other slaves in his cage clutched their bowls protectively, afraid that someone might steal from them. One of them tried to steal Kaladin's food on the first day. He'd nearly broken the man's arm. Now everyone left him alone. Suited him just fine. He ate with his fingers, careless of the dirt. He'd stopped noticing dirt months ago. He hated that he felt some of that same paranoia that the others showed. How could he not, after 8 months of beatings, deprivation, and brutality? He fought down the paranoia. He wouldn't become like them, even if he'd given up everything else, even if all had been taken from him, even if there was no longer hope of escape. This one thing he would retain. He was a slave, but he didn't need to think like one. He finished the slop quickly. Nearby, one of the other slaves began to cough weakly. There were 10 slaves in the wagon, all men, scraggly, bearded, and dirty. It was one of 3 wagons in the caravan, through the unclaimed hills. The sun blazed reddish-white on the horizon, like the hottest part of the smith's fire. It lit the farming clouds with a spray of color, paint thrown carelessly on a canvas. Covered in tall, monotonously green grass, the hills seemed endless. On a nearby mound, a small figure fitted around the plants, dancing like a fluttering insect. The figure was amorphous, vaguely translucent. Windspread were devious spirits who had a penchant for staying where they weren't wanted. He'd hoped that this one had gotten bored and left, but as Kaladin tried to toss his wooden bowl aside, he found that it stuck to his fingers. The Windspread laughed, zipping by, nothing more than a ribbon of light without form. He cursed, tugging on the bowl. Windspread often played pranks like that. He pried at the bowl, and it eventually came free. Grumbling, he tossed it to one of the other slaves. The man quickly began to lick at the remnants of the slop. "Hey," a voice whispered. Kaladin looked to the side. A slave with dark skin and matted hair was crawling up to him, timid, as if expecting Kaladin to be angry. "You're not like the others." The slave's black eyes glanced upward, toward Kaladin's forehead, which bore 3 brands. The first 2 made a glyph pair, given to him 8 months ago, on his last day in Amaram's army. The 3rd was fresh, given to him by the most recent master, Shash. The last glyph read, "Dangerous." The slave had his hand hidden behind his rags. A knife? No, that was ridiculous. None of these slaves could have hidden a weapon. The leaves hidden in Kaladin's belt were as close as one could get, but old instincts could not be banished so easily, so Kaladin watched the hands. "I heard the guard stalking," the slave continued, shuffling a little closer. He had a twitch that made him blink too frequently. "You tried to escape before," they said. "You have escaped before." Kaladin made no reply. "Look," the slave said, moving his hand out from behind his rags and revealing his bowl of slop. It was half full. "Take me with you next time," he whispered. "I'll give you this, half of my food from now until we get away. Please." As he spoke, he attracted a few hunger spread. They looked like brown flies that flitted around the man's head, almost too small to see. Kaladin turned away, looking out at the endless hills and their shifting, moving grasses. He rested one arm across the bars and placed his head against it, legs still hanging out. "Well," the slave asked, "you're an idiot. If you gave me half your food, you'd be too weak to escape if I were to flee, which I won't. It doesn't work." "But 10 times," Kaladin whispered. 10 escape attempts in 8 months, fleeing from 5 different masters. And how many of them worked? Well, you're still here. 8 months. 8 months as a slave. 8 months of slopping beatings. It might as well have been an eternity. He barely remembered the army anymore. "You can't hide as a slave," Kaladin said. "Not with that brand on your forehead." "Oh, I got away a few times, but they always found me, and then back I went." Once men had called him lucky, storm-blessed. Those had been lies, if anything. Kaladin had bad luck. Soldiers were a superstitious sort, and though he'd initially resisted that way of thinking, it was growing harder and harder. Every person he had ever tried to protect had ended up dead, time and time again. And now, here he was, in an even worse situation than where he'd begun. It was better not to resist. This was his lot, and he was resigned to it. There was a certain power in that, of freedom, the freedom of not having to care. The slave eventually realized Kaladin wasn't going to say anything further, and so he retreated, eating his slop. The wagons continued to roll, fields of green extending in all directions. The area around the rattling wagons was bare, however. When they approached, the grass pulled away, each individual stalk withdrawing into a pin-prick hole in the stone. After the wagons moved on, the grass timidly poked back out and stretched its blades toward the air. And so, the cages moved along what appeared to be an open rock highway cleared just for them. This far into the unclaimed hills, the high storms were incredibly powerful. The plants had learned to survive. That's what you had to do. Learn to survive. Brace yourself. Weather the storm. Kaladin caught a whiff of another sweaty, unwashed body and heard the sound of shuffling feet. He looked suspiciously to the side, expecting the same slave to be back. It was a different man this time, though. He had a long black beard stuck with bits of food and snarled with din. Kaladin kept his own beard shorter, allowing Tavlakev's mercenaries to hack it down periodically. Like Kaladin, the slave wore the remains of a brown sack tied with a rag, and he was dark-eyed, of course, perhaps a deep dark brown, though with dark eyes it was hard to tell. They all looked brown or black unless you caught them in the right light. The newcomer cringed away, raising his hands. He had a rash on one hand, the skin just faintly discolored. He likely approached because he'd seen Kaladin respond to that other man. The slaves had been frightened of him since the first day, but they were also, obviously, curious. Kaladin sighed and turned away. The slave hesitantly sat down. "Mind if I ask how you became a slave, friend? Can't help wondering. We're all wondering." Judging by the accent and the dark hair, the man was a Alethi, like Kaladin. Most of the slaves were. Kaladin didn't reply to the question. "Me? I stole a herd of chol," the man said. He had a raspy voice, like sheets of paper rubbing together. "If I had taken one chol, they might have just beaten me. But a whole herd, 17 head." He chuckled to himself, admiring his own audacity. In the far corner of the wagon, someone coughed again. They were a sorry lot, even for slaves, weak, sickly, underfed. Some, like Kaladin, were repeat runaways, though Kaladin was the only one with a Shash brand. They were the most worthless of a worthless caste, purchased at a steep discount. They were probably being taken for resale in a remote place where men were desperate for labor. There were plenty of small, independent cities along the coast of the unclaimed hills, places where foreign rules governing the use of slaves were just a distant rumor. Coming this way was dangerous. These lands were ruled by nobody, and by cutting across open land and staying away from established trade routes, Tavlakov could easily run afoul of unemployed mercenaries, men who had no honor and no fear of slaughtering a slave master and his slaves in order to steal a few chols and wagons. Men who had no honor. Were there men who had honor? No, Kaladin thought. Honor died 8 months ago. "So," asked the scraggly bearded man, "what did you do to get made a slave?" Kaladin raised his arm against the bars again. "How did you get caught?" "Odd thing that," the man said. Kaladin hadn't answered his question, but he had replied. That seemed enough. "It was a woman, of course. Should have known she'd sell me. Shouldn't have stolen chols. Too slow. Horses would have been better." The man laughed riotously. "Horses? What do you think, me a madman? If I'd been caught stealing those, I'd have been hung. Chols, at least, only earned me a slave's brand." Kaladin glanced to the side. The man's forehead brand was older than Kaladin's. The skin around the scar faded to white. "What was that glyph pair?" "Sas Moram," Kaladin said. It was the High Lord's district where this man had originally been branded. The man looked up with shock. "Hey, you know Eclipse?" Several of the slaves nearby stirred at this oddity. "You must have an even better story than I thought, friend." Kaladin stared out over those grasses blowing in the mild breeze. Whenever the wind picked up, the more sensitive of the grass stalks shrank down into their burrows, leaving the landscape patchy, like the coat of a sickly horse. That windspread was still there, moving between patches of grass. How long had it been following him? At least a couple of months now. That was downright odd. Maybe it wasn't the same one. They were impossible to tell apart. "Well," the man prodded, "why are you here?" "There are many reasons why I'm here," Kaladin said. "Failures, crimes, betrayals. Probably the same for most every one of us." Around him, several of the men grunted in agreement. One of those grunts then degrunted into a hacking cough, persistent coughing, part of Kaladin's mind thought, accompanied by an excess of phlegm and fevered mumbling at night. Sounds like the grindings. "Well," the talkative man said, "perhaps I should ask a different question. Be more specific. That's what my mother always said. Say what you mean and ask what you want. What's the story of you getting that first brand of yours?" Kaladin said, feeling the wagon thump and rolled beneath him. "I killed a Light Eyes." His unnamed companion whistled again, this time even more appreciative than before. "I'm surprised they let you live." "Killing the Light Eyes isn't why I was made a slave," Kaladin said. "It's the one I didn't kill. That's the problem." "How's that?" Kaladin shook his head, then stopped answering the talkative man's questions. The man eventually wandered to the front of the wagon's cage and sat down, staring at his bare feet. Break. Hours later, Kaladin still sat in his place, idly fingering the glyphs on his forehead. This was his life, day in and day out, riding in these cursed wagons. His first brands had healed long ago, but the skin around the Shash brand was red, irritated, and crusted with scabs. It throbbed, almost like a second heart. It hurt even worse than the burn had when he grabbed the heated handle of a cooking pot as a child. Lessons drilled into Kaladin by his father whispered in the back of his brain, giving the proper way to care for a burn. Apply a salve, prevent infection, wash once daily. Those memories weren't a comfort. They were an annoyance. He didn't have four-leaf sap or Lister's oil. He didn't even have water for the washing. The parts of the wound that had scabbed over pulled at his skin, making his forehead feel tight. He could barely pass a few minutes without scrunching up his brow and irritating the wound. He'd grown accustomed to reaching up and wiping away the streaks of blood that trickled from the cracks. His right forearm was smeared with it. If he'd had a mirror, he could probably have spotted tiny red rodsmen gathering around the wound. The sun set in the west, but the wagons kept rolling. Violet Salas peeked over the horizon to the east, seeming hesitant at first, as if making sure the sun had vanished. It was a clear night, and the stars shivered high above, tall in the sky. A swath of deep red stars that stood out vibrantly from the twinkling white ones was high in the sky this season. That slave who'd been coughing earlier was at it again. A windspread, or riverspread, could mimic voices and expressions, but they didn't actually think. They didn't. "Did you hear any of that?" Kaladin asked, turning to the cage's other occupants. The roof was just high enough to let Kaladin stand. The others were lying back, waiting to get their ladle of water. He got no response beyond a few mutters to be quiet and some coughs from the sick man in the corner. Even Kaladin's friend from earlier ignored him. The man had fallen into a stupor, staring at his feet, wiggling his toes periodically. Maybe they hadn't seen the sprint. Many of the larger ones were invisible, except to the person they were tormenting. Kaladin sat back down on the floor of the wagon, hanging his legs outside. The windspread had said his name, but undoubtedly she just repeated what he'd heard before. But none of the men in the cage knew his name. Maybe I'm going mad, Kaladin thought, seeing things that aren't there, hearing voices. He took a deep breath, then opened his hand. His grip had cracked and broken the leaves. He'd need to tuck them away to prevent further. "Those leaves look interesting," said the feminine voice. "You like them a lot, don't you?" Kaladin jumped, twisting to the side. The windspread stood, in the air just beside his head, white dress rippling in the wind Kaladin couldn't feel. "How do you know my name?" he demanded. The windspren didn't answer. She walked on air over to the bars, then poked her head out, watching Tvlakov the slaver administer drinks to the few slaves in the first wagon. She looked back at Kaladin. "Why don't you fight? You did before. Now you stopped." "Why do you care, Spirit?" She cocked her head. "I don't know," she said, as if surprised at herself. "But I do. Isn't that odd?" It was more than odd. What did he make of a spren that not only used his name, but seemed to remember things he'd done weeks ago? "People don't eat leaves, you know, Kaladin," she said, folding translucent arms, then cocked her head. "Or do you? I can't remember. You're so strange, stuffing some things into your mouths, leaking out other things when you don't think anyone is looking." "How do you know my name?" he whispered. "How do you know it?" "I know it because it's mine. My parents told it to me. I don't know." "Well, I don't either," she said, nodding as if she just won some grand argument. "Fine," he said, "but why are you using my name?" "Because it's polite, and you are impolite." "Spren don't know what that means." "See, there," she said, pointing at him. "Impolite?" Kaladin blinked. Well, he was far from where he'd grown up, walking foreign stone and eating foreign food. Perhaps the spren who lived here were different from those back home. "So why don't you fight?" she asked, flitting down to rest on his legs, looking up at his face. She had no weight that he could feel. "I can't fight," he said softly. "You did before." He closed his eyes and rested his head forward against the bars. "I'm so tired." He didn't mean the physical fatigue, though 8 months eating leftovers had stolen much of the lean strength he'd cultivated while at war. He felt tired, even when he got enough sleep, even on those rare days when he wasn't hungry, cold, or stiff from a beating. So tired. "You've been tired before." "I failed, Spirit," he replied, squeezing his eyes shut. "Why must you torment me so?" "They were all dead, Sen and Dalit, and before that Tux and the Takers, before that Tien, before that blood on his hands and the corpse of a young girl with pale skin." Some of the slaves nearby muttered, likely thinking he was mad. Anyone could end up drawing a spren, but you learned early that talking to one was pointless. Was he mad? Perhaps he should wish for that. Madness was an escape from the pain. Instead, it terrified him. He opened his eyes. Tvlakov was finally waddling up to Kaladin's wagon with his bucket of water. The portly brown-eyed man walked with a very faint limp, the result of a broken leg. Perhaps. He was Thalen, and all Thalen men had the same stark white beards, regardless of their age or the color of the hair on their heads, and white eyebrows. Those eyebrows grew very long, and the Thalen wore them pushed back over the ears. This made him appear to have 2 white streaks in his otherwise black hair. His clothing, striped trousers of black and red with a dark blue sweater that matched the color of his knit cap, had once been fine, but it was now growing ragged. Had he once been something other than a slaver? This life, the casual buying and selling of human flesh, seemed to have an effect on men. It worried the soul, even if it did fill one's money pouch. Tvlakov kept his distance from Kaladin, carrying his oil lantern over to inspect the coughing slave at the front of the cage. Tvlakov called to his mercenaries. Bluth, Kaladin didn't know why he'd bothered to learn their names, wandered over. Tvlakov spoke quietly, pointing at the slave. Bluth nodded, slab-like face shadowed in the lantern light, and pulled the cudgel free from his belt. The windspren took the form of a white ribbon, then zipped over toward the sick man. She spun and twisted a few times before landing on the floor, becoming a girl again. She leaned in to inspect the man, like a curious child. Kaladin turned away and closed his eyes, but he could still hear the coughing. Inside his mind, his father's voice responded. "To cure the grinding coughs," said the careful, precise tone. "Administer 2 handfuls of blood ivy, crushed to a powder, each day. If you don't have that, be certain to give the patient plenty of liquids, preferably with sugar stirred in. As long as the patient stays hydrated, he will most likely survive. The disease sounds far worse than it is. Most likely survive." Those coughs continued, Someone unlatched the cage door. Would they know how to help the man? Such an easy solution. Give him water, and he would live. It didn't matter. Best not to get involved. Men dying on the battlefield. A youthful face, so familiar and dear, looking to Kaladin for salvation. A sword wound slicing open the side of a neck. A shard bearer charging through Amaram's ranks. Blood, death, failure, pain. And his father's voice. Can you really leave him, son? Let him die when you could have helped. Storm it. Stop, Kaladin yelled, standing. The other slave scrambled back. Bluth jumped out, slamming the cage door closed and holding up his cudgel. Tvlakov shied behind the mercenary, using him as cover. Kaladin took a deep breath, closing his hand around the leaves, and then raising the other to his hand, wiping away a smear of blood. He crossed the small cage, bare feet thumping on the wood. Bluth glared as Kaladin knelt beside the sick man. The flickering light illuminated a long, drawn face and nearly bloodless lips. The man had coughed up phlegm. It was greenish and solid. Kaladin felt the man's neck for swelling, then checked his dark brown eyes. It's called the grinding coughs, Kaladin said. He will live if you give him an extra ladle of water every 2 hours for 5 days or so. You'll have to force it down his throat. Mix in sugar, if you have any. Bluth scratched at his ample chin, then glanced at the shorter slaver. Pull him out, Tvlakov said. The wounded slave awoke as Bluth unlocked the cage. The mercenary waved Kaladin back with his cudgel, and Kaladin reluctantly withdrew. After putting away his cudgel, Bluth grabbed the slave under the arms and dragged him out, all the while trying to keep a nervous eye on Kaladin. Kaladin's last failed escape attempt had involved 20 armed slaves. His master should have executed him for that, but he had claimed Kaladin was intriguing and branded him with shash, then sold him for pittance. There always seemed to be a reason Kaladin survived when those he tried to help died. Some man might have seen that as a blessing, but he saw it as an ironic kind of torment. He'd spent some time under his previous master speaking with a slave from the west, a Slay man who had spoken of the old magic from their legends and its ability to curse people. Could that be what was happening to Kaladin? Don't be foolish, he told himself. The cage door snapped back in place, locking. The cages were necessary. Tvlakov had to protect his fragile investment from the high storms. The cages had wooden sides that could be pulled and locked into place during the furious gales. Bluth dragged the slave over to the fire, beside the unpacked water barrel. Kaladin felt himself relax. There, he told himself. Perhaps you can still help. Perhaps there's a reason to care. Kaladin opened his hand and looked down at the crumpled black leaves in his palm. He didn't eat these. Sneaking them into Tvlakov's drink would not only be difficult, but pointless. Did he really want the slaver dead? What would that accomplish? A low crack rang in the air, followed by a second one, duller, like someone dropped a bag of grain. Kaladin snapped his head up, looking to where Bluth had deposited the sick slave. The mercenary raised his cudgel one more time and snapped it down, the weapon making a cracking sound as it hit the slave's skull. The slave had uttered a cry of pain or protest. His corpse slumped over in the darkness. Bluth casually picked it up and slung it over his shoulder. No! Kaladin yelled, leaping across the cage and slamming his hands against the bars. Tvlakov stood, warming himself by the fire. Storm you! Kaladin screamed. He could have lived, you bastard! Tvlakov glanced at him. Then leisurely, the slaver walked over, straightening his deep blue knit cap. He could have gotten you all sick, you see. His voice was lightly accented, smashing words together, not giving the proper syllables emphasis. Dalen's always sounded to Kaladin like they were mumbling. I would not lose an entire wagon for one man. He's past the spreading stage, Kaladin said, slamming his hands against the bars again. If any of us were going to catch it, we'd have done so by now. Hope that you don't. I think he was past saving. I told you otherwise. And I should believe you, deserter? Tvlakov said, amused. A man with eyes that smolder in hate? You would kill me. He shrugged. I care not, so long as you are strong when it is time for sales. You should bless me for saving you from that man's sickness. I'll bless your Karn when I pile it up myself, Kaladin replied. Tvlakov smiled, walking back toward the fire. Keep that fury, deserter, and that strength. It will pay me well on our arrival. Not if you don't live that long, Kaladin thought. Vlokov always warmed the last of the water from the bucket he used for the slaves. He'd make himself tea from it, hanging it over the fire. If Kaladin made sure he was watered last, then powdered the leaves and dropped them into the Kaladin froze, then looked down at his hands. In his haste, he'd forgotten that he'd been holding the black mane. He'd dropped the flakes as he slammed his hands against the bars. Only a few bits stuck to his palms, not enough to be potent. He spun to look backward. The floor of the cage was dirty and covered with grime. If the flakes had fallen there was no way to collect them. The wind gathered suddenly, blowing dust, crumbs, and dirt out of the wagon and into the night. Even in this, Kaladin failed. He sank down, his back to the bars, and bowed his head, defeated. That cursed windspread kept darting around him, looking confused. End of chapter.